But being governor isn't all he's accomplished. He served our country in the U.S. Navy as a JAG officer, spending time in Iraq in support of the Navy SEAL mission in Fallujah, Ramadi, and the Al-Anbar province. He received the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service and the Iraq Campaign Medal. Following his military service, he worked as a federal prosecutor and was later elected to Congress in 2012. It was then that he developed a close relationship with Heritage, collaborating on education, economic security, and yes, cultural issues. We're proud to continue working closely with him as governor. Just last year, Heritage recognized Florida as the top state in America for parental rights and school choice, largely because of his leadership. Conservatives are craving a bold and visionary leader who gets things done, and that's exactly what Governor DeSantis has accomplished in Florida. Please enjoy this video.
My job as a leader is to put the interest of the people I represent and their jobs over my own interest in keeping my own job. I guess I'm not surprised that Biden doesn't remember me. I guess the question is what else has he forgotten? Biden's forgotten about the crisis at our southern border, I can tell you that.
They are not interested in having the FBI go after the guy in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which was an intentional act of terrorism, but they somehow think a parent who is upset that somehow they are a domestic threat. Give me a break.
We will be signing the largest expansion of education choice, not only in the history of this state, but in the history of these United States. That is a big deal.
If I had $1 for every lockdown politician who decided to escape to Florida over the last 2 years, I'd be a pretty doggone wealthy man. There's a reason why people are pouring into the state of Florida.
The fight with Disney was really about who governs the state of Florida. I think they thought for 60 years they called the shots. Well, there's a new sheriff in town, and we call the shots, and we made that very clear.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, from the state of Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis.
Thank you. Greetings from the free state of Florida. You know, as I was coming into D.C., I noticed that as of January of 2023, 5 of the 10 cities where people were relocating to all happened to be in the state of Florida. I also noticed that Washington, D.C. had one of the highest exit rates for homeowners of any place in the country. And where was the #1 destination for those people fleeing Washington, D.C.? Miami, Florida. Now, Florida has been a refuge for those who have been fleeing disastrous policies imposed by leftist state and local governments. And Florida, because of our leadership and the folks in our state, we've really become the beating heart of the conservative movement in these United States. And so, Dr. Roberts, if you ever think about bringing Heritage south. I know there'll be a lot of logistics in that, and I can't promise everything, but I can promise you lower taxes, safer streets, better schools, and much saner government. So the choice is yours. Florida is the state where our shared ideas and values actually become political reality. In D.C., big conservative victories are few and far between. In Florida, we deliver big victories every single day. We reject the culture of losing that has infected the Republican Party in recent years. In Florida, we know that there is no substitute for victory. And when we have, in 2018, I was elected governor by about 32,000 votes out of over 8 million votes cast. That is less than 0.5% victory margin. And even though that was very close, it honestly wasn't out of the ordinary for what had happened through most recent Florida history. If you look at 2010, 2012, 14, 16, margin. And even though that was very close, it honestly wasn't out of the ordinary for what had happened through most recent Florida history. If you look at 2010, 2012, 14, 16, and of course my election in 18, in presidential races, in governor's races, they were usually decided by 1 point. And so I was getting ready to take the reins, having won a close election, and was advised to trim my sails, not to rock the boat, kind of keep my head down, because you don't want to upset this very delicate political balance that the state of Florida found itself in. If you went in too hot, then maybe you could lose support and give the Democrats the upper hand. And it was not crazy advice, but it was advice that I rejected, because ultimately I may have earned 50% of the vote, but that conferred upon me 100% of the executive power. And I resolved I was going to use that to advance a conservative agenda that would take Florida in a great direction. And to do that, it really has to be based off principle and based off conviction. And so I told myself before taking office, I'm not going to poll issues to tell me what to think. And to this day, I have never consulted a poll about any decision I've made as governor. Leaders don't be captive to polls. Leaders get ahead of public opinion, chart the course, and then the people follow. We also said going in that you can make the best decisions in the world as an executive, you can have great policies, but if you don't have a cadre of people who are serving in the administration, who share the vision, who are going to put the interests of the state and the viability of the agenda ahead of any of their own personal interests or agenda, then a lot of it doesn't amount to very much. And so we told people, if you're bringing any other agenda to this endeavor other than what's in the best interest of the people of Florida and what we promised Floridians we would deliver, then pack your bags right now. We don't have time for it. We're not going to stand for it. And we've been able to operate an administration that does not get consumed in controversy or drama or palace intrigue. We basically execute the mission day after day after day, and we're able on their toes in the process. And that's another thing about going in, particularly as an executive. I look around, and sometimes Republicans will get into office, and they're almost like potted plants. They don't want to do anything with the authority that they have. And here's the thing, you understand why sometimes, because every decision you make as a leader, some people are going to like it, other people are not going to like it. And so if you just don't do anything, then maybe you alienate fewer people. And so that's kind of been something that's done. Now, my view is we got to go on offense. We need to be leaning into issues. We need to be raising issues when other people are going to worry about what the left and the media say about us. We are going to do what is right. I mean, in fact, if the media is not attacking me, then I wonder I must be doing something wrong. So it's actually good, positive feedback. And the final thing we said was, you know, when you get elected to executive position like governor, you can be right on policy, you can do some other things, but you must demonstrate leadership. That's the type of position that calls for it. And leadership is really about having the courage to do what's right in the face of intense, withering criticism and opposition. It requires you to have to stand all alone sometimes when the currents are against you. And so that's something that we had to do during COVID, because the decisions that we were making were met with withering criticism by the left, by the corporate press, by bureaucrats like Fauci, and even by many Republicans, and a lot of people, my supporters, people that were friends of mine and really cared for my future said, you are getting killed. You've got to start doing something different because this ain't working out for you. But you know, my view was a leader has got to put the interests of the jobs of the people he represents over trying to protect your own political hide. So I was totally willing to let the chips fall where they may, as long as I can look in that mirror knowing I did what I thought was right. And of course, it ended up working out well for us. Fast forward 4 years later, November of 2022, we didn't win by 32,000 votes. We won by over 1.5 million votes, the highest percentage of the vote that any Republican has ever received in a gubernatorial election. We were able to win over 60% of the Hispanic vote in the state of Florida. We won women by 8%. We were able to win independents by 18%, and we flipped blue urban counties like Miami-Dade red, which had not been done in a long time. And we won Miami-Dade by double digits. Can you believe that? But it wasn't just about me. I mean, I recognize as somebody that's leading the top of the ticket, you know, I have a responsibility to help bring in other people into office at various levels. So we put a lot of effort, a lot of resources into helping people run for the legislature, helping candidates for school board. We ended up earning a super majority of Republicans in the Florida legislature, largest majorities we've ever had. And we got engaged in 34 school board races and were able to help elect 29 new conservative school board members throughout the state of Florida. And when the dust settled after November and when the newly elected personnel took office in January, that represented the first time since the Civil War era that there was not one single solitary Democrat elected to statewide office in the Sunshine State. And what does that mean? Don't take it from me. This is a headline from one of the corporate media publications. Quote, "There's no plan, there's nothing. Florida Democrats in despair over the future." That is what you call winning as Republicans when they're doing that. Now, we believe that politics isn't about entertainment. It's not about building the brand on social media. That politics ultimately is about producing results. And we have produced results that have been second to none throughout this country. Kevin mentioned some of it, but Florida is the fastest growing state in the country. We lead the nation in net in-migration and have every year since I've been governor. Number one in new business formations, number one in education freedom, and that was even before we expanded it in this most recent legislative session. Yes, number one for parental involvement in education. We have no state income tax, and those of you who live in this area, you should try it sometime. It works out pretty well, trust me. We have the second lowest state per capita tax burden in the United States, and we have the second lowest per capita debt burden in the United States, and we've been able to accumulate the largest budget surplus in the history of the state of Florida by a country mile. Now, none of that would have been possible had we not been the ones that, when the world went mad during COVID, when common sense suddenly became an uncommon virtue, we in Florida stood as a refuge of sanity, as a citadel of freedom for people in our state, but coming in from other states, and even people that came from around the world to escape what was going on in their states or their countries. We refused to let our state descend into some type of Faucian dystopia where people's livelihoods were destroyed and their freedoms were curtailed. No, we chose freedom over Fauciism. And I think it's important and we stood against it at every turn. on keeping people employed, businesses viable, making sure kids could be in school, banning vaccine passports, banning COVID shot mandates for school children, and of course saving people's jobs for those who did not want to take the mRNA shot. And so every time we needed to step up, we did. And I think it's important that people aren't allowed to rewrite history about any of this. Fauciism was wrong. Fauciism was destructive. Fauciism was responsible for students being locked out of school throughout this country for a year. Fauciism was responsible for people being forced to take vax. Fauciism was responsible for putting us on a path to some of the economic problems that we see now. We can never let that happen to our country again. Now, Florida, we're happy to be leading on the issue of education. The purpose of schools is not to impose political indoctrination on the students. We believe in the traditional classical mission of education. We want to be able to pursue truth. We want to be able to promote rigor. We want to give students the foundation so that they can think for themselves and be citizens of our republic. And part of that means we need to embrace the rights of parents to have a fundamental role in the education and upbringing of their kids. We have done that by enacting the Parents' Bill of Rights in the state of Florida. We've also done it by enacting curriculum transparency in the state of Florida. You have a right as a parent to know what's being taught in your kid's school. You have a right to be known what type of materials are being used. And, the media is really upset that we're doing this because the parents are going now in Florida and they're objecting to things that violate state standards or that are inappropriate. And some of this, unfortunately, is pornographic material where you have this stuff being portrayed and totally inappropriate. And so parents have blown the whistle on it. And what the left will try to say is this is a book ban. They want to ban books from school. And so what I did an event in Florida called Exposing the Book Ban Hoax, because it is a hoax. But before I spoke, before we got the parents to speak, we played a video that showed what material was being removed from either classrooms or libraries. And the local news stations who were covering the press conference had to cut their feed because they said it was too graphic to air. Well, if it's too graphic to air on the 6 o'clock news, how is it okay to be in front of a 9-year-old student? We will not allow our schools to be captive to an ideological agenda, and we have eliminated critical race theory in our K-12 schools. We're not teaching kids to hate our country or to hate each other with your tax dollars. We are going to embrace, and we have embraced, a renewed emphasis on American civics. We need to teach our students what it means to be an American. We need to teach them about our constitutional foundations so that when they graduate, they're not listless vessels as citizens, but they actually have a strong understanding of why people have fought and died for our country. We also are the only state in the country that sets aside one day every year to teach our students about the victims of communist regimes throughout history. We're telling the truth about Marxism and Leninism. And the education stuff is important because as a governor, I know how important it is to the future of our state and really to our country. And so I see that very clearly, but I also see these issues through the lens of a dad of a 6, 5, and 3-year-old. And my wife and I both just believe that parents should be able to send their kids to school, kids should be able to watch cartoons, kids should just be able to be kids without having somebody's agenda shoved down their throats. It is wrong to teach a 2nd grader that they may have been born in the wrong body. It is wrong to teach students that gender is a choice. And we don't allow that in Florida. And the left didn't like it, a lot of the media didn't like it, and Disney didn't like it. But we govern the state of Florida, not them, and so we've done what's right to make sure that our education is sound and that our children and parents are protected. We've also had to do things like protect women's sports, which I'm very happy to do, but it's sad that we're even having to do that, and it's also sad that we're having to combat doing puberty blockers and sex change operations for minors. Who would have thought that would have been something that would have been appropriate? Now, that as a physician, you lose your medical license, and we have more to come with our legislator. It's not just K-12. We're also leaning in on higher education. You've seen over many, many years and maybe even decades, higher education has been utilized to pursue a political agenda rather than being moored into the pursuit of truth. So we've enacted reforms in Florida so that now every tenured professor in our state university system must undergo review every 5 years and can be let go for poor performance. And within the next few weeks, I'll be signing legislation to make Florida, I think, the first in the country. I think we may beat Texas to it, but I think they're going to do it too, and I hope they do. We are eliminating so-called DEI in our public university system. Root and branch, it's done. They say it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the way it's practiced, all it is about the imposition of an ideological agenda on the student body and even on the faculty. No, we think as practice, DEI more appropriately stands for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination, and that has no place in our public institutions. And so part of what we're called upon to do with education, all these other issues, is combat what I call the woke mind virus. Woke ideology is a form of cultural Marxism that seeks to divide our society on the basis of identity politics. It is an attack on merit and an attack on achievement. It represents a war on truth. Don't tell me that babies are born racist. Don't tell me that men can get pregnant. That is not true, and I do not accept that. The woke represents a war on truth, and because it's a war on truth, we must engage in a war on woke. We reject the weaponization of corporate power under the guise of things like ESG, and we've worked to eliminate that from state pension fund, and we're going to be enacting statutory protections against it very, very soon. ESG is basically window dressing for using corporate assets to advance a left-wing agenda on society. And here's the thing. We can win elections, we can say the right things, we can even do the right things. If the left can just impose its agenda through corporations or other private means, and we don't do anything about it, then we are going to be losing. What they are trying to do is they're trying to do an end run around our constitutional system. They know these policies like a war on fossil fuels and domestic energy, war on the Second Amendment and other types of individual rights. They know that that would not work at the ballot box. So they can just do an end run around that process, engage in this to try to change policy or change culture without ever being held accountable. They're going to take that opportunity to do it, but that is going to change our country for the worse. And so I just think as conservatives, you know, it's not conservative to just simply defer to every corporation in America. That's being a corporatist. And so when I have to look to see in the state of Florida, you know, are we being governed appropriately? Are we advancing the rule of law? And I have to take on a company like Disney, you know, a corporatist would say that you have to give Disney everything at once. Well, in reality, Disney was enjoying unprecedented privileges and subsidies. They controlled their own government in Central Florida. They were exempt from laws that virtually everybody else had to follow. They had great tax uses that to wage war on state policy regarding families and children. So we said that arrangement doesn't work for us. that self-governing status is gone. And that's exactly what we did, and we were right to do that. And now, more recently, they tried to do an end run around that to preserve self-governing in defiance of the legislature, and we're now counteracting that. And again, if you're a corporatist, you would not want to counteract that because you would let them do whatever they want. But if you're somebody that believes that we, the people, ultimately govern, and that we should have a rule of law, and a free enterprise means actually everybody follows the same set of rules, then what Florida is doing is exactly and precisely correct. And we're going to continue to do what is correct. One of the reasons we see all these problems in cities with crime is woke ideology is infecting how people are doing law and order and criminal justice. You have policies like defund police. You have policies and politicians that were egging on the BLM riots in 2020. I can tell you in Florida, when we saw that happening in Minnesota, these other places, I mobilized the National Guard immediately. I had state law enforcement stationed around the state. We sent the message, you're not burning down the state of Florida. And we weren't going to take it, and we didn't do it. We've also enacted legislation that bars local governments from defunding the police. I mean, you can have 3 yahoos on any city council do something stupid, but we're not going to let their citizens suffer as a result of that. We'll keep the cops on the street and put the money back in. We even did legislation to guarantee that those involved in rioting, looting, and other types of mob violence didn't just get a slap on the wrist like they do in Portland, but that they would get the inside of a jail cell and actually be held accountable. That anti-riot legislation was actually criticized by the United Nations, and I wear that criticism as a badge of honor. We also reject policies that eliminate cash bail and that allow criminals to get out of prison before they've completed their sentence. Those policies have been tried in this country, and those policies have failed in this country. And finally, we recognize the problem and the danger of left-wing prosecutors getting elected in some of these deep blue areas, usually with financial support from people like George Soros, and they pledge to be effectively a law upon themselves. They don't like a particular law, so they will not enforce it. They will weaponize their office to advance an ideological agenda. When we had somebody doing that in Tampa, who was also supported by Soros, and he said there were certain laws he refused to enforce, I removed him from his position. He is gone. We also reject the woke idea that we are somehow citizens of the world and somehow we're not uniquely American. No, we're Americans, and we're American citizens, and our sovereignty as a country matters. Our borders as a country matters. And if you look at millions of people that have poured in illegally through both intent of Biden but also neglect, and the drugs that have come in and the criminal aliens and people on the terror watch list, this has been an absolute farce. A country that can't even maintain its own border. Give me a break. In Florida, we've been on offense against illegal immigration. We've banned sanctuary cities in our state. We actually work with the Coast Guard near the Florida Keys because they try to run boats into Florida from Haiti and Cuba and other places. And so we've supplemented Coast Guard operations at my direction. We've now repatriated over 11,000 illegal aliens since August alone, back to Haiti, back to Cuba, and now the boats are coming basically at a trickle because isn't it amazing? When they know you're going to enforce the law, they don't even try to come like they're doing now at the southern border. But the thing that bugs me, you don't even hear about this from most media organizations. In fact, the only time I really saw them get concerned about the border and about illegal immigration was when we had 50 illegal aliens show up in Martha's Vineyard. Then they got really upset that happened. Of course, they removed them off Martha's Vineyard the next day, even though they said they were a sanctuary jurisdiction. I think to ultimately solve the problem of illegal immigration and the border, you need a lot of things. but you do need to actually construct a wall along the southern border. Walls work. It allows you to use your resources more efficiently. And what I've told President Biden is, I've got some know-how in Florida. When Hurricane Ian came through in September, really wrecked Southwest Florida, almost a Category 5 storm. One of the things it did was it knocked out a bridge going from the mainland to Pine Island. It also severed the Sanibel Causeway in 3 different areas. Now, those are not bridges operated or owned by the state of Florida. They're local. The locals were telling the residents of those places it's going to be 6 months before this can get back running so that you can get back and forth via land, and so make some other arrangements. And so that was really a problem for a lot of the folks because their islands would have probably withered on the vine. So they came to me and said, Governor, can you help us? I said, yeah, I'll help. It's okay, what do we do? So I got my guys together. I said, okay, I don't want any bureaucracy, I don't want any red tape, and I don't want any excuses. Let's just build this and get it done. And so instead of taking 6 months, we were able to reopen the Pine Island Bridge in 3 days, and then 2 weeks later, reconfigured the Sanibel Causeway. I just raised that because I'm willing to send those guys in Florida to the southern border to build a wall. Come on, Joe, put us in. We'll get it done. So we're proud of the stands that we've taken, but when you win elections, it's, yes, a vindication of what you've done, and we were proud to have done that and won in historic fashion, but more than that, it's an opportunity about being able to deliver even more. And so far, just since the election in November of 2020 in Florida, we have already done the following. We have taken the #1 education choice state in the country, and we've put it on steroids. We now have universal ESAs, the largest expansion of school choice in American history. That is on the books. We also, because we're mindful about having a good economy with not having bad incentives, after many decades of complaining, we enacted the largest tort reform in the history of the state of Florida. We're no longer going to be a litigation hellhole. We recently signed the heartbeat bill to protect life. We've signed constitutional carry because you shouldn't need a permission slip to be able to exercise your Second Amendment freedoms. Yes, we have stripped Disney of its self-governing status. We've also fortified our Office of Election Crimes, which is an agency in state government that actually brings prosecutions against people who vote illegally or who manipulate our elections. We've expanded our illegal alien transport program, and we've enacted $500 million of toll relief for our commuters. So that's already in the tank. We're still in session now. Here's what's to come. We're going to have the strongest anti-ESG legislation anywhere in the country. We are, as I mentioned, going to eliminate DEI from our public universities. We are going to prohibit land purchases by CCP-linked businesses throughout the state of Florida. We're going to enact a prohibition on so-called central bank digital currencies in the state of Florida. We're going to provide an excess. The previous record was $1.2 billion for tax relief. We're going to do over $2 billion in tax relief. That's the largest in Florida history. And we're going to, even though we have the second lowest per capita debt, we're going to institute with our surplus an accelerated debt repayment program. So we're soon going to have the lowest per capita debt in the country, and we're proud of that. We're doing the largest increase in teacher salaries in Florida history, but we're pairing that with paycheck protection for teachers so that they don't have automatic union dues deducted. If they want to write a check, you can write a check, because we want those salaries going to the teacher's pocket, not to the union's pocket. We are making sure that students are not forced to pick pronouns in our schools. We didn't do that till about 5 days ago, so we're just going to do normal school. There's going to be protection against that. We're going to enact what even some of the legacy media outlets have admitted is the strongest package of reforms against illegal immigration anywhere in the country. So that will be done. And then finally, all the good work we did to protect people from COVID authoritarianism, we are making all those protections permanent, and we are expanding those protections so that this violation of freedom can never happen again in our country. Now, this is a pretty big contrast in terms of productivity and results than what you're seeing in Washington, D.C. I mean, just look at the way we govern ourselves fiscally. Florida, we have millions of more people than New York State does. New York State's budget's twice the size of our budget. What are they getting for that? And of course, we have a big surplus, low tax, and very reasonable regulatory climate. What are they doing in Washington? Profligate spending, trillions and trillions of dollars printed by the Federal Reserve, massive amount of debt that continues to accelerate, and of course with interest rates going up, servicing that debt is becoming even more expensive. One of the ways you could actually deal with inflation, instead of having the Fed raise everybody's interest rates and hurt the economy, you could actually moderate federal spending and stop spending so much. That shouldn't be that big of a deal. It's the right thing to do fiscally. It would also help with the inflation. Another thing you can do to help with inflation is stop waging war on domestic energy production. We have what we need to be totally energy independent and to be the #1 energy producer in the world. All we've got to do is do it. Instead, Biden makes it harder, and he squanders our strategic petroleum reserve. And of course, you see what they're doing with open borders, where states like Florida and Texas are actually fighting back. They are just simply allowing the problems to mount. But of all the things going on in Washington, to me, one of the most significant is the continued power wielded by an unaccountable, weaponized administrative state. This bureaucracy represents a perversion of constitutional government and is one of the greatest threats to our freedoms as American citizens. This is a leviathan that is supposed to serve the people, but instead it looms over us and imposes its will upon us, oftentimes with no congressional authorization whatsoever. When President Reagan came on the scene, he used to say that the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And he was right about that, but I think what he was responding to was a government that had run amok. There was a lot of zeal about the efficacy of central planning in the 1960s. They were going to end poverty and do all these things, and whatever those intentions were, the results were disastrous, and it was holding our society back. I think the difference between Reagan's time and this time is, yes, the federal government's big, yes, it's creating problems, and the bureaucracy continues to do that, but that power has been weaponized. It's being wielded by one faction of society against other factions of society that it doesn't like. So, for example, what happened during COVID? You had CMS and OSHA, with Congress never doing anything to authorize this, impose mandates on individual Americans that said if you do not take an mNRA shot, which was emergency use only, you would lose your job. And so we fought back against that in Florida, the OSHA mandate. We refused to enforce the CMM mandate. CMS, they fined me, but you know what? We saved thousands of nurses' jobs in the process, so we're happy to be able to do that. You've seen the administrative state collude with big tech to censor truthful information, whether it's people attacking COVID lockdowns, whether it's them questioning the efficacy of masks or school closures. There was a concerted effort for big tech companies to do what government is never permitted to do directly. And then when you have the FBI not worried about things that I think really we would want them to be worried about as much, but worried about parents going to school board meetings in Northern Virginia, you know that this is an administrative apparatus that has lost its way. This is not the way the Constitution was designed. The Constitution was designed to vest Article II executive power in the President of the United States. You'd have elections to determine who that individual was, but once that election was done, the President implemented policy, implemented an agenda, using Congress, things you could do executive, you could, and the purpose of agencies was to simply carry out the law and carry out the directives. That has been unmoored from the foundations over many, many decades, and part of the reason is Congress has let it happen. The #1 power they have is the power of the purse strings. So if an agency is abusing authority, you can use the purse strings to curtail that agency's power. You also have the power to legislate. Congress doesn't like to make tough decisions. And so what they've done over the years is they pass suggestions where they delegate to the bureaucracy the difficult task of actually making decisions about how the law should be implemented. And so when you do that, when you abdicate your responsibility, of course power is going to accumulate in the administrative branch, and it's going to become some fourth branch of government. The founders would have predicted that, especially knowing what human nature is. This is not something that we should be surprised about based on what's going on. So I think we need, and I know we have a lot of warriors in Congress that are trying to do this now, Congress needs to reassert its constitutional authority. These agencies answer to the American people. They are not self-perpetuating bureaucracies that have the ability to do whatever the heck they want to do. You also need a determined and disciplined chief executive to root out politicization and corruption throughout the whole executive branch. That is not an easy thing to do. That would take day-to-day trench warfare over a period of many, many years, but anything short of that is just simply not going to get the job done. And here's why it matters. The left is playing for keeps. If you look at what happens in 2024, if the Democrats are able to sweep all the offices, President, Senate, and House, what will they do with that power? They will try to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. They will try to abolish the Electoral College. They will try to make Washington, D.C. a state so they get 2 left-wing senators virtually for life, and they will try to eliminate voter ID across this country and mandate ballot harvesting in every state of the union. Now, I don't think any of us think that that's a very positive agenda, but even people that aren't terribly political, how many American families are sitting at the dinner table saying, oh man, I wish we could just mandate ballot harvesting across the U.S., or I wish we could get rid of voter ID. No, they're talking about crime and education and inflation and all these other important issues. So that's not an agenda that's speaking to the aspirations of the average American. It's an agenda that a political movement is pursuing to try to lock the conservative half of the country out of power, to try to keep our voices from being heard in the affairs of our state, in the affairs of our country. You know, President Reagan said that freedom's one generation away from extinction. It's not passed along in the bloodstream. It needs to be fought for. And I always appreciated that quote, but for most of my life, I thought it was a little bit over the top. I thought it was a little bit hyperbole because, you know, we're Americans. Isn't freedom just in our DNA? Could we really lose freedom over one generation? Well, if you've been around and followed what's gone on the last 4 or 5 years, I think Reagan was right. Our freedom is fragile. Our freedom needs people to stand up and fight for it. And you know, the Founding Fathers also agreed with President Reagan. When they went to create the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, they had come having studied the history of every republic and the history of mankind, because they wanted to draw lessons to determine how they could apply those lessons to the current situation. And what they found was that there was really only one thing that all these republics had in common, and it was this: every one of them had failed. And so they really believed that it fell to the United States of America to determine, can we really govern ourselves? Can you have a society in which our rights are God-given, not come from government, in which the rule of law prevails over the rule of man? Or is mankind forever destined to live under various forms of despotism? And it was this country, they believed, that would answer that question, and I think that's the question we still must answer today. We must embrace the founding creed of this country, that our rights are not the courtesy of the government, but are a gift from Almighty God. We must reject the idea that self-government can be subcontracted out to bureaucratic and technocratic elites who simply reduce us to mere data points. We must insist on the restoration of constitutional government so that government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. We have a responsibility to carry on and preserve what the father of our country called the sacred fire of liberty. It's a fire that burned in Philadelphia in 1776 when 56 men pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor so that we could have a new nation conceived in liberty. It's a fire that burned at a cemetery in Gettysburg when the nation's first Republican president pledged this nation to a new birth of freedom. It's a fire that burned at the foot of the Berlin Wall in 1987 when a resolute president said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and help lead to the destruction of communism in Europe. This is a big responsibility. It's our responsibility. It's not one that we should shirk from. It's one that we should welcome. We need to reject the pessimism that is in the air about our country's future, because at the end of the day, decline is a choice, success is attainable, and freedom is worth fighting for. And I can tell you this, down in the state of Florida, we have only begun to fight. Thank you all. God bless. Appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you. How you doing? Thanks so much. Appreciate it. God bless you all.